characterize them. And I was wondering if there are any more questions about that, especially about this identity relation thing we talked about. I have a feeling that I went over this a bit quickly. Remember we said this characterizes all the reflexive frames, right? So that reflexive frames, that is pretty well known. And I claimed that that these two jointly together characterize the class of all identity frames, identity relations. Did you philosophers convince yourself that that is true? I don't know if there's a name for this, but intuitively we can paraphrase this requirement as saying for every world there is at least a loop. Every world must have at least a loop around it, and maybe more links than that, right? More outgoing links, perhaps. And the second one requires that there is at most a loop, either none or one. I mean this, but nothing going anywhere else. And these two together require there to be exactly one loop and nothing else. No less and no more. To show this again, I want to show this, yesterday I did this with this biconditional, which wasn't really very helpful, I think. So the claim is that this axiom is valid on F frame, right, if and only if. Now how do we call this? Every world has at most a loop, so they are all by themselves, right? They're all isolated. There are no connections, if and only if. So all worlds are alone. They have either no link or just a loop. Right? Again, this biconditional here, and so we can prove these two directions separately. Suppose this is valid and the frame does not have this property. Well, what does it mean that the frame does not have this property? Well, there is a world, right? There are in fact two worlds, W and W prime, that are not identical, right? And linked by the relation. Now, if this is the case, then we can find a truth assignment that is a counterexample to this axiom. So there are these two worlds, so there must be something like W and W prime, regardless of whatever else is going on in this frame. There may be other links here, but there has to be one such thing. That's what it says here. In order for this to be to violate this property. And you can see that it's very easy to find a truth assignment which then makes this a counterexample. Just say it's true here and false here, and there you are. That's all. So that proves this one direction, left to right. And the other direction, so suppose F is lonely, I don't know how to call this. F has this property, right? Has property P, that's not good, uppercase P, where P is something like, for all worlds W and W prime, if W r W prime, then W equals W prime. That's what this constraint is, right? At most, a loop. So it has this property, and this is not valid. Is not valid. If this is not valid, well, there has to be some assignment and a world, all right, such that B at W of P is true, and B at W of necessarily P is false. Now this is a necessity statement, a universally quantified statement, right? How can this possibly be false? Certainly it cannot be, we must have some link going out of W. There has to be an accessible world, otherwise it would be vacuously true, right? If there is no accessible world, then this has to be true. So from this, we already know there is some W prime. This just follows from the truth conditions of this statement, right? Such that W r W prime and W prime of P is false. But then since it's true here and false here, they can't be the same. And that proves the other direction of the claim. Okay. So these two axioms together, they characterize the class of all identity frames, and that is what Kratzer calls total realism, right? Where the modal base is a singleton set containing the world that you start from. So I think it's better to treat these as two different ones rather than what I did yesterday was just write one sentence which was this, but it may be a bit less clear. Okay, so are there any questions about that topic? Anything left about relations and so on? No? Okay. So we also talked about ordering sources and their interactions with the modal base and the additional modal forces that we get in this way, right? Somewhat weaker interpretations of necessity statements, somewhat stronger interpretations of possibility, right? And also then with regard to conditionals, these new modal forces account, or well, they help us develop an account of the invalidity of certain inference patterns, right, in natural language, like strengthening of the antecedent and that sort of thing. So we went over that. And the last topic was this root versus epistemic modal issue, which is really sort of open-ended because there is no agreement in the literature, and I don't really have a strong opinion either. I mean, I subscribe to the view that epistemic models take wide scope, and I also believe that in conditionals, if all this, even if all you see in the consequent is a deontic model, there still is an epistemic modal base that takes wide scope over the whole conditional. How that works syntactically exactly, I'm not so sure. I don't have a story about that. So today, if there are no further questions, sorry. All right, today we will be talking about time and modality and tense. My plan is here to spend the first well, maybe the whole morning sort of preparing for this discussion of the paper, and then leave 2 hours in the afternoon for that. We'll see how this works out, but I'm really flexible. There are 2 handouts here because, to be honest, I have recycled a handout from talks that I have given on this topic. It's a bit modified, but not much. But before we go there, I'd like to just go through some of the basics of tense logic, and also some of the motivations for the kinds of models that, for example, Thomason advocates in that paper that was about combinations of tense and modality. So we'll see if this takes all morning, that so be it. Maybe we'll be done sooner, and we can perhaps already start next hour discussing this, discussing the definitions a little bit in detail and so on. So, but first the topic is tense logic. Perhaps the first thing that should be said about this is that it's a misnomer. It's not about tense, it's about time. These people, they don't treat tense in any way that's adequate for the interpretation of natural languages. Those philosophers would like to think so, but it's pretty poor as a treatment of natural language tenses. What they do give us is an account of temporal relations in general. And there are also another thing that needs to be made clear is that modal logic, I said this once before I think, even though it's called modal logic, is not particularly, in its applicability, it's not particularly suited, or, well, not only suited for the analysis of modality in language, right? That's where it got its name from, because it's about necessity and possibility. But you can apply it to anything, any area where you have transitions or change or alternatives, right? I'll list some things here in the beginning. You can use modal logic. I mean, finite state machines are basically frames, right? If you're familiar with that. And you can talk about what has to be the case and so on. In fact, some of this is useful in understanding the view of time and tense that underlies the models that we'll be talking about. If there's time, we can talk about that discussion a little bit. About that connection. And then I'll list these other things in robotics and in business and economics. Everywhere you can apply modal logic to make things clear. And so too, you can in the domain of time. Okay. So there, let's start with this little language that is introduced in this chapter of the Gamut book, okay, which looks almost like the one we have already been using. It's again a propositional logic which has this language of standard propositional logic, right? With just the connectives, negation, conjunction, disjunction, and so on, right? That we started out from before on Thursday, right? You have atomic propositional letters. You have these truth conditional compounds, truth functional compounds. And so let's just go with that. And then we say, I'm not writing all those clauses again. We just say, if phi is in this language, then so are. Now here we have P, H, F, and G as our operators. And as it said in the text, these stand for past and future, and these for has been and is going to be. There's no particular good intuitive reason why they are called so. It may be rather confusing, but technically they have very clear-cut definitions. The P and the F, they are existential quantifiers. They are like our diamond. And the G and the H are universal quantifiers like the box. Okay. So PF are like this, and GH are like this. So why do you have two things? Well, because in time you can go in two directions, right? Backward and forward. And these make precisely that difference. Okay. So in the model we will have a notion of earlier than, which is our accessibility relation, an earlier than relation. So you can write T1 and T2 stand in this relation. What this means really is that T1 is earlier than T2, and then you can see that the past is possibility with regard to this relation. Why? Well, because if you think about it, at some time, this is true. Now this corresponds to our R, right? Before I wrote this little R subscript on our modal operators, right? This is true if and only if for some t prime such that t this t prime, right? This is just putting this in place of the R, otherwise it's exactly the same definition that we've seen. T prime t is true. That is the intended reading, the intended interpretation of this. It doesn't say so actually. It's not quite defined in this way in the book. There, or also on the handout, in fact, is that you don't see this clause. I apologize, but it's actually illuminating to look at it this way, because we haven't defined this thing. We only have one relation. So there, this is of course equivalent as to saying that if and only for some t prime such that t prime is earlier than t, b t prime t is 1. This is what you see. But so, well, you can just if you define this other accessibility relation, then you can keep the t and t prime uniform. It depends. And in the future, this possibility with regard to the other accessibility relation, right? Because this is this is one if and only if for some t prime such that t is earlier than t prime, right? P is true at t prime. And this again, of course, could also be written out in this other way. We'll just say here you could. Well, here you wouldn't need. Well, you wouldn't want this actually. You could say this, but well. So normally what you see are these two clauses in texts, right? These two. Oh, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, right? T up here, sorry. These two are what you normally see, because normally you only go with one relation. Okay, so what should the model look like? Or should we perhaps look at some of these sentences that we are told to translate into this modal logic on page 33, exercise 7. If you look at A, do you have that text? Now you are still young, but one day you will no longer be, things like that. So if we have for our P, you are young, and then we have to, of course, discard a lot of linguistically interesting material here because currently we don't have any means of dealing with that. Words like now, words like still and but and no longer, none of that can be expressed in this simple language, right? All the interesting elements in the sentence go away. I'm talking about exercise 7 on page 33 if you have to think. So now you are still young, but one day you will no longer be. We can only give a very well, so an approximate translation of this, which we can do as good a job as we can with these limited means here by saying that if this is our atomic proposition, then this simply means P, right? And in the future, P will be false. There will be a time when P is false. And then, of course, it also follows that once P is false, it never becomes true again. But that is perhaps part of what it means to be young. I mean, that's not a logical element of the semantics. It comes from the lexical semantics. So this is all we have. Or B, I am faithful to you and I always will be. Well, it's almost the same. These are a bit boring, perhaps, these examples, but if, let's say, F is I am faithful to you, then this sentence is simply, well, I am faithful, right? And I always will be. Now we use the universal quantifier, right? Going to be faithful at all times. Right. So yeah, simple things like that you can try a little bit. Perhaps F is interesting too. Do you have to? You don't have to write those sentences, do I? You have them in front of you, right? I hope so. Oh. Okay, here's the sentence. A sea battle will be fought or not. And if a sea battle will be fought, that has always been the case. Now this isn't a philosophically interesting example. So if S is a sea battle, and I'll just say is fought, right? What this says is that, well, it's actually not so clear, right? How do you translate this? A sea battle will be fought or not? Do you want to say something like this? Or something like perhaps this? Or perhaps it's not so clear, right? The sentence is a bit ambiguous. Or do you have an opinion? Do you think, which one is the correct one? Well, this is interesting, but let's not get into this right now. Which one of them might be the correct one? It's probably one of these two, because this, as long as there are future times, this is trivially true, right? It's not so interesting. But these two are actually, they say something about the nature of truth if you have more than one possible future and so on, which we'll talk about later on. So And you may wonder what it takes for these things to be true. These constituents in themselves, and then also the whole sentence. And then what does it say? If a sea battle will be fought, this has always been the case. That, I suppose, would be translated as if this is the case, then this is the case, right? You may wonder about this, now we know that tomorrow there will be no typhoon crossing Japan. But has that always been true? Certainly we could not always have known that, right? 10 years ago it was not predictable that tomorrow would be without typhoon, right? It could not be known. So the claim that it has always been true is not so obvious, right? This is a very contentful and bold philosophical claim that has been around since Aristotle, because he used the sea battle example to discuss precisely this question. What about the truth of sentences that refer to the future? Are they already true or false? Do they not have truth values? What about them? We'll get there in a little while. And perhaps we'll talk about this example again. Now for the model, okay, we have a set of times. I already referred to them actually in writing these definitions. Now let me get rid of this. So a model currently is a very simple thing. We have a frame, of course, right? Always in modal logic we have a non-empty set of worlds. Now they are not called worlds but times, but they are still play the same role, right? A non-empty set T and a relation. So non-empty, and this is a relation between these members of T, right? And then eventually we also want a evaluation function, right? So we can put that in there as well already. This is the frame, and now we have the model, okay? And the V is just like we had it before with the worlds, now with the times. I already said, V at T of P. This is something which is then either 0 or 1, right? And whether this model is appropriate for talking about time or not depends on the properties of the accessibility relation, right? So we have to ask ourselves a bit, what are our basic intuitions about time? And there are a few things that people generally agree on. So if this, perhaps I should also give this a name, right? We have to agree on what intuitively this relation should stand for. And I already said earlier then, is usually how people talk about it. It could be later then, it wouldn't make any difference, right? It would just be the mirror image. So let's say this is the earlier than relation. So what are our intuitions about the earlier than relation? Is it reflexive? Oh, right, there's no time is earlier than itself. Well, although that already depends on sort of deeper philosophical questions. Is time circular? Can you pass through the same point twice? As I understand, the old Buddhists thought so, right? That every 20,000 years or so, whatever, you go in circles like that. Generally nowadays it is not assumed, but if that were the case, then a time could be earlier than itself, right? Because you go around the loop and then you're there again, many years later. But at least in the Western literature, this is not assumed. There, the idea is that, well, first of all, it's irreflexive, right? Irreflexive, that means you can't have this, right? You can just move through time and never leave the point in time that you're at. Just doesn't make sense. You could still have circles if you have larger loops, right, through other times. To rule that out, you can't say that, I mean, we would want to say this anyway, that it's transitive, because our intuition is that if one time is earlier than the second, and the second is earlier than the third, and the first is earlier than the third, right? That just makes sense. And these two together, they already rule out the possibility of going in circles. Because now it follows from this, you don't have to stipulate that these two together entail that it's asymmetric. Asymmetric. And well, think about, do that on your own, figure out why that means you cannot go in circles. And so currently this lets us model time like this. We have this and this. We have no circles, but we have these links, right? Doesn't really quite account yet for our intuitions, because this doesn't rule out cases like this, right? And then you can even go this way. Is that ruled out? I don't think so. Oh. You don't want that, right? Time doesn't work like that. Now if you add to these two requirements the requirement that it is connected, then you get rid of these cases. Let's see, what does connected mean? We didn't discuss it very much. It means that simply for all t and t prime, either they are the same, or they stand in the relation one way or the other. So for any two points in time, you can establish which way it goes. If they are distinct, then one must be earlier than the other. Okay. And then if you were to look at these unintuitive structures, you will see that you cannot get any cross links between them anymore. So these three now, they imply that time looks like this. And now you also have all of these guys, right? Everything, all these transitivity links, right? I don't want to write them there, but they are there. If you have anything else, try for yourself. You necessarily violate one of these axioms if you go in any other direction or so. Okay. And now, so the sentences are evaluated at times like this, right? And so the future is here, the past is here, and that's all. That's the model. So the clauses for these interpretations, as I give them there on page 4, they are as we expect, and I already said them. You don't need to go through that. It's just exactly the way we are used to doing that. And one more remark that I make there is that, also as before, we can write this, the denotation of a sentence in this model, as the set of times at which it is true. Before we were talking about propositions as sets of worlds. Now propositions are sets of times. Same thing. T of time is 1. And the connectives, conjunction, disjunction, so on, they correspond to these set theoretical operations as we had it with possible worlds. Is that easy enough? If any questions, we're going to go through anything else about this. Should we look at some examples? There's a model in the text here in this standard text. Want to go for that? Is it helpful when we do these things here? Yes? Thank you. For example, exercise 8 on page 37. There we have a model, and then we are asked about the truth and falsehood of certain statements about that model, or in that model. So let's see. First, we're asked to draw a picture, and it looks like this. We don't need to. It's not very difficult to come up with. But if you look at it, we have T1. Okay. T1 is earlier than T2. T1 is also earlier than T4. Wait a second. I should warn you now. This is not a linear order. Where is it? Let's see. T1 is earlier than T2. Also earlier than T4. And then we have 2 goes to 3, 4 to 5, and these come together again over here. 6 and 5 to 6. That's right. And so truth values are assigned at various points to the sentence P. It's true at all worlds except 4 and 5. So here we have not P. We have P, 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 P. Okay. All right. Now, so are the following formulas valid in this model? Remember, valid in the model meant valid at all possible worlds. It's not valid on the frame, valid in the model, right? If not P, then FGP. So if P is false, then there will be a future time from which, from then on, P is always true. Is that valid in this model or not? Are there any worlds where this is false? What would it take for it to be false? Well, we have to look for a world where P is false, right? No, where this is false, sorry. No, sorry, where not P is true, so P is false, right? So where the antecedent of this is true, right? And this is false here. Is there a world with these two properties? Well, there are two worlds where P is false, T4 and T5. But the thing is never violated, right? Because there is a future, namely, well, in fact, from here you have T5, but also, yeah, you have T5 such that it is always, for all future worlds, P is true. From here you have T6 such that for all future worlds P is true. There are no future worlds from this point on. Therefore, sentence is true. The GP is true. So to write this here. So GP is true at this world. Therefore, FGP is true here. Right. And likewise, GP is true here, and therefore FGP is true here. I should have warned you for another thing here. This exercise doesn't even assume that the transitivity links are filled in. It doesn't, otherwise it would be clear, right? It doesn't assume that. And to take another example, if F not P, then FF not P. Is that valid? Is there a counterexample to this? What would the counterexample look like? Well, again, we would say this has to be true, right? F not P. So this is the world we are looking for. And this is false, not FF not P. Okay. Is there such a world? Well, there is in fact only one world in which F not P is true. Oh, two worlds, sorry. This one and this one, right? T1 and T2. T1 and T4 are the only ones where F not P is true. So we have to check them. At T1 is not FF not P true or false? Well, let's see. We want it to be false. So what we hope is to find that FF not P is true, right? And it is, because we have not P here. We have F not P here. Therefore FF not P here. Okay. So T1 is not a counterexample, but T2 might be. You have to check T2 as well. And you can already see, well, F not P is true at T2, but FF not P this time is not true, because you have to look at the world that you can reach in 2 steps, right? And there's only one world that you can reach in 2 steps. I'm always talking about worlds. I hope this is not confusing. I'm sorry. Times, of course. Times. Okay. There's only one time that you can reach in 2 steps, namely this. P is true here, therefore FP is true here, and therefore FFP is true here. So at T4, this is true and this is false. And so the whole sentence is not valid in the model. Okay? So it's hard to do this. It's exactly the same as with worlds. I even keep using the same word. We can also look at perhaps B in this exercise. Decide which property of time, the time axis, is characterized by each of the following principles. So these are axioms again that you might try to think about. Let's look at the first one. That is a pretty interesting one. The third one we already know. Wait a second, let me check something here. Yeah, the third one we already know. You may not see that immediately, but you can check that. Let's do that first. Third one. If, what does it look like? If PP then, sorry, if PP phi then P phi. Okay. This is valid if and only if the time axis is transitive. Okay, that's the claim. That's my claim, and we can check that. So, you know, it's precisely the way we did it before. Suppose this is valid and the frame is not transitive, right? So if it's, I'm not writing all the steps on the board this time. If the frame is not transitive, then you must have 3 times like this without the link in between. So, and then within these 3, you can find the truth value assignment that provides a counterexample. And it's very simple, I think, in this case. You simply say for some formula, for some sentence P, right? You say let P be true here and false here, and then here at this world you have P, and you have not PP. It's that simple. Now, if it were transitive, I don't want to go with these 2 directions all the time, but you can see here, if it were transitive, then this certainly would not work, right? Because then, in fact, PP would be true here, right? Because you cannot, this is then direct in the past. And there is no other way to falsify the axiom if the frame is transitive. So, well, let me leave this there. A is also interesting. It characterizes something that sometimes, in some applications of modal logic, is pretty important. We can write that briefly. Get rid of this here. It says if fg phi then gf phi. If there is a future time at which, from which on the phi will always be true, then necessarily there is such a time from which, well, I'm not paraphrasing this very lucidly, perhaps. Let's just go through the steps here. Suppose you have something like this. Let's say T1, T2, T3. And we may first ask, is this valid on this frame? And it's perhaps not so easy to see. There is no analog of this in what we have talked about so far in connection with possible worlds. Well, what can you say? For example, okay, if so, this can only be true at T1 because it's the only one that has a time in the future. So this right, because F requires an existential quantification. So let's look at T1 and see what is required for this thing to be true or to come out valid. It is not valid on this frame, that much I can tell you right away. There has to be, okay, so there are 2 accessible times, G phi, T2 and T3, and the claim is that if G phi is true at either of them, then f phi is true at all of them. Right? That's what it says. See that? So it doesn't matter which one we take. Let's just say g phi is true at one of them. In fact, you can see g phi is true at both vacuously because there is no future time from there. Presently here is true at both of them, right? And therefore f g phi is true here. In fact, doubly true as it were, because we even have two worlds, right? Okay, so far so good, but you can see immediately that it's not the case that for both of these you have f phi. F phi is an existential quantifier, so f phi is false at both. And therefore not g f phi at this world, at this time. So in order to make this true, this consequent of the material implication here, you have to add future worlds, at least, well, actually you have to add a future world to both of them, right? Each of them has to go somewhere. So we have T4 up here first. Let's stick with this. Now at least you have an accessible time. The f phi can be true at this at this time. But now g phi here can no longer be true vacuously, right? It was vacuously true because there was no accessible time. Now there is an accessible time, so phi has to be true here. It has to be, otherwise we already violate the first here, and then this wouldn't be true at T1 anymore. Now consider the case, so I mean, if this were not true at T1, then this wouldn't be a counterexample at all. We are still trying to look at possible counterexamples. So we have to make sure that this is true here, and then ask what else needs to be the case in order for the rest to be true, right? That's the argument. Now here we have, in fact, f phi, right? That's good. We still don't have g f phi here because we haven't done anything to this one. So let's say we add one to this as well, and let's say it goes this way, T5, and then by the same argument, T5, phi, and by the same argument. We have the phi has to be true here because we want to make sure that this is true at the first world. Wait a second. Actually, it doesn't. Sorry, a minute. It doesn't have to be. Yeah. Let's see. It goes this way. Right, suppose, I just made a mistake here. As I said, it has to be phi. It doesn't have to be phi, right? Because fg phi is already true. It's guaranteed to be true because of this branch. We don't have to enforce this. So this actually doesn't have to be true either. Let's look at this. If we have this frame, then we can have a value assignment under which this is true and this is false at T1, simply by saying that phi is false here, and then not f phi is this here at this one, and then we don't have g f phi anymore. So this is not a frame that on which the axiom is valid. This is still a counterexample. How do we rule this out? And without going through further arguments, I don't want to spend so much time on this. Here it's 11 o'clock, almost. This is valid whenever these two come together. now it's impossible to make this a counterexample. I haven't yet shown that this is really the only way for this frame to satisfy the axiom, but just take my word for it. This is sometimes called a confluence axiom. That's what this property is called, that two branches that go in different directions must come together again at some point. Okay, so I hope this was a bit helpful. So it gave us some facility with these matters. Yeah, let me actually say this, go to the next section before we take a break, because it's fairly short, and then we can, and we started a bit late, 5 minutes late, so I can use those 5 minutes, I think, for this, to make it a full hour. Okay. Here's something that we haven't yet talked about at all, but which will come up in this, talking about this paper in the afternoon. In general, when you read the linguistic literature on modality or tense or aspect, all these things that have to do with temporal notions and so on, you don't often see these operators anymore. They were very popular in the 80s. But nowadays, people say these same things without these operators, namely in first order predicate logic. And there are good reasons for doing that, but before we go to those reasons, just convince yourself that it is possible to talk in first order predicate logic about these things, where before we had something like FP, okay, you know, this is true at, well, at T, right, if and only if. Now let me write our clause in first order logic, right? There is a T prime such that T is earlier than T prime, and this. Now, you know, now if you evaluate this form, if you had a language that contained all these symbols, a predicate for the accessibility relation, and some way of stating, you know, that these sentences are true or false, basically treating these sentences as denoting properties of time, right? Remember, a property is a set of things, right? If you're familiar with that form of semantics. If you had a language that has all these things, then you could just, you know, translate the sentence into this kind of expression in the first place, right? Because this now is true if and only if, well, there is such a time, right? It's the same. It has the same truth condition. It says the same thing. And you can, if you have a language that is rich enough, you can say anything that you can say in modal logic in this language. But there are things that you can say in this language that you cannot say in modal logic. And some of them turn out to be important in the analysis of natural languages. So something that you can